everyone for joining today. The webinar today is Challenges with Hiring an International Medical Graduate, and we know that now more than ever international medical graduates really play a critical role in supporting Australia's healthcare workforce, particularly in general practice and particularly in regional areas. However, for practices that haven't retained an IMG before, it does have certain regulatory, contractual and governance challenges that practices should fully understand to be able to manage carefully. Today's session is going to help you where practices encounter challenges, understand where practices encounter challenges, and also how to reduce risk through proper structuring and governance. Like all of our webinars, I do like to start with an acknowledgement of country. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today and pay my respects to elders past and present. One of the special things about coming in on a webinar is that we're all in different traditional lands, and I'm here on Kaurna land and very happy to be here. And I would like to extend my respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today as well. This is a disclaimer. You would be disappointed if a legal related webinar didn't start with a little bit of a disclaimer. So this presentation is really going to be for general guidance only. Legal advice should be taken in relation to you taking actions on the specific issues that we talk about today. I've got guests with me today. I'm very excited about that. For some reason, the next slide is me introducing myself. So why don't I do that? And then I will allow my guests to introduce themselves as well. So my name is Sarah Bartholomeusz. I'm the principal of U Legal. We provide legal solutions for healthcare practices, and we believe that doing that actually helps to secure the whole medical system for all Australians. And so it's got this flow-on effect that we're very passionate about protecting your practice and allowing you to grow that practice on strong foundations. I've written a book. It's called Growing a Medical Practice. I'm not sure if you can see it, From Frustration to a High-Performance Business. And this book is a guidebook for practices who are wanting to do that, to start, grow, and sell their practice with the right legal foundations in place. Now, enough from me. Chioma, would you like to introduce yourself, or I can introduce you? It's really up to you, but I think it's nice to hear from you.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Chioma Amaechi. I am the principal solicitor and owner of CA Legal and Migration. So we work with doctors and medical practices regarding their migration needs and questions and everything in between. A bit of a personal story. So we came to Australia almost 20 years ago now. My husband is a GP, so forgive me. And we stayed in we're in regional South Australia, and that was how the story began. And that's my interest in working with medical practices. Migration for doctors and practice owners is a bit unique, is a niche form of the employer-sponsored visa space. And like Sarah has pointed out, there is a lot of regulatory requirements and exceptions, when employing an IMG in your practice. So it's really a pleasure to speak with you guys today.
Thanks, Chioma. And Megan, here's your picture.
That is my picture. I added a new background to it. My name is Megan Shorter. People Medical Consulting is my company, and we specialize in recruitment Australia-wide, specifically for general practitioners and general practices. I have a special passion for IMGs. I always have. I don't know where it came from, but I actually started People Medical back in 2014 specifically because I didn't feel like there was enough support for IMGs in the industry, and I wanted to have my business focus on the IMG space. So We've been doing it for nearly 12 years now, and it's been very exciting to see all of the, I say exciting, I will tell you that sometimes I'm under my desk with a box of chocolates. Exciting and frustrating to see all of the changes in the industry over the last 12 years. And we're in a particularly interesting time at the moment, which we'll obviously go into in the webinar about supply and demand of GPs and where the real bottlenecks are, and how, as Sarah said, IMGs really are the key to recruitment in medical at the moment, I think.
Yeah, great. Excellent. So I'm just going to describe who this webinar is for and what you're going to get out of it. And then if you've accidentally joined this webinar, you don't have to stay and listen to us for the rest of it. But if it's actually something that you're really interested in, then hopefully this will pique your interest about what we're going to talk about today. So this webinar is for medical practice owners, directors, or board members considering hiring an IMG or having an IMG recruitment strategy in your business. A practice manager responsible for workforce planning, compliance, or contracts, or an advisor supporting medical practices with employment, governance, or regulatory obligations. So that's the who, and this is what we're hoping you're going to get out of this session. So a clearer understanding of the regulatory and compliance requirements involved with hiring IMGs. When I said IMG earlier to my husband, he said, "Oh, I thought you meant OMG, like, oh my gosh." And I was like, no, that's a different thing. So it is probably a little bit jargony, but hopefully if you're on this webinar, you already know what an IMG is. Practical insight into common legal, contractual, and governance pitfalls and how to avoid them. Guidance on structuring, supervision, employment, and contracting arrangements appropriately from the outset. Increased confidence in navigating AHPRA and medical board expectations when engaging IMGs, and greater clarity around the risks, responsibilities, and documentation required to support both the practice and the IMG. And why this matters is getting the engagement of this is not simply a contractual or administrative issue. When international medical graduate arrangements aren't structured properly, the consequences can affect the practice operationally, financially, and reputationally. For example, regulatory non-compliance can affect the doctor's ability to practice, which directly impacts patient care and practice revenue. Most importantly, these risks are largely preventable when engagements are structured appropriately from the outset. IMGs are essential to the growth and viability of many practices. However, their engagement involves additional regulatory oversight and hurdles that you do need to manage carefully. I'm going to hand over to Chioma to talk about the options for visas, because this is really her area.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So I will look at this from two angles. So first off, I will discuss visa options, and then the second time I will discuss processes, and very quickly, speak about what could go wrong. So when it comes to employing an IMG, and the doctor could be offshore, that's overseas at the moment, or here in Australia, there are various visa options. And I always, when I consult with practices, I always get them to think about a migration strategy from the beginning. So it's not something you kind of, oh, there's a doctor, let's sponsor them, case closed. Because you're looking at somebody with a story around them, that conversation should happen upfront. So there are temporary visas, and then there are permanent visas. And the eligibility of your doctor could depend on their story, their age, health conditions, and how their years of experience. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So for the temporary visas, we have the subclass 482. I find that most doctors, because of their income, they might fall under what we call the specialist skills stream. And there's also the subclass 494. I have not used that before. Reason being that for a doctor to be eligible for the subclass 494, it's preferable that they just go for the permanent residency, because that requires 3 years of experience, and the subclass 186 also requires 3 years of experience. So there are lots of numbers and acronyms and weird and wonderful digits in this. So it's always good to sit down and have a conversation with your immigration lawyer and your doctor, because the doctor could start with a temporary visa with a view in your mind that they would move on to a permanent visa later. But you would have to consider the age of the doctor. Does the doctor have adult children that would turn 23? And the important conversation as well is to find out what the doctor's long-term plans are. Unlike other occupations, a medical practitioner or a general practitioner can work with different employers without consequence, even though you are the sponsor. So I will explain this a little bit. So most occupations, you must have an employer-employee relationship for the temporary visas. But for medical practitioners, they are exempt. So we find that I have more than 95% of my clients engage the doctors as independent contractors for the temporary visa. Now, if the doctor now chooses to move on to a permanent visa, you would need to have an employer-employee relationship. And when that happens, you have to have this conversation upfront, because the risk is if the doctor is not getting this conversation, they could move to another practice. In the next slide, if we have a look at the next slide, I will just use that. Yeah, so you would find out that engaging a doctor in your practice tends to cost some money, not just for the professional fees, but for immigration. There are 4 steps. The first step is your practice must become a standard business sponsor. And this is an application you make to Home Affairs. You provide your financials, you provide the structure, details about the structure of the practice, and you have to explain and convince Home Affairs that you are committed to meeting your sponsorship obligations. Now, when this is approved, or while this is still pending, you now have to apply for what we call a nomination application. And this is you now specifically nominating this medical practitioner. So you have just one nomination per practitioner. And to be eligible to nominate someone, you have to show that you've tried to advertise for this position, and there's very strict advertising criteria. And at the end of that, you would need to pay what we call a Skilling Australia Fund levy. So depending on your turnover, okay, if your turnover is less than 10 million, you're going to pay Home Affairs 1,200 for each year of sponsorship. Now, if you spend all that money and your general practitioner your doctor doesn't stay, that's a cost that you cannot recoup from the doctor. So I get asked a lot, we're spending all this money to engage a practitioner. Can we get the money back? And the answer is no, especially for your temporary visas. So that's a big compliance issue. When Sarah was talking about this, there's a compliance issue, there's regulatory requirements. You do not request your doctor to pay you back the money. And you have to have, yes, he's not an employee, but for most cases, it's always a good thing to have an independent contractor, a services agreement. There should be a document stating this is who we're employing, this is how much we're going to be paying him, not just a percentage of billings come in and work. So that agreement should be documented properly. And after the nomination application, the third step is now the visa application. And in this case, the doctor should have their registration approved by APRA. That's where Megan will come in. They should, have the years of experience. So, and that it's quite unique for doctors as well, because in some cases, the time spent during their internship might count as years of experience. I often get asked, can we sponsor a doctor for a permanent visa first if they are overseas? And this would depend on two things. It depends on the practice and it depends on the doctor. The practice, you have to understand that you haven't met this person, they haven't worked for you, there's the culture issues. Would they be able to settle down as a permanent, you're sponsoring them for a permanent visa. So they really don't need to stay with you when they get into Australia. So those are things that you could consider, and you would also need to consider their years of experience. So for the permanent visas, they have to have at least 3 years of experience. So when we do those assessments and conversations around the migration strategy, that is what we talk about and discuss. Now, most important thing is the compliance requirement. So it's not a question of I have my doctor, he's working, everything is all hunky dory. There are compliance requirements. Home Affairs does spot checks. They do, and they do this through the Australian Border Force. One of your obligations as your employer sponsor is your duty to keep records, your duty to provide records when you are asked. Especially if you have your doctor as an employee. They're going to look through the employment contract, they're going to look through pay slips, they're going to look at leave requirements. So things have to be done properly. This relates to those who are employing doctors not as an independent contractor, but maybe as an employee, because they're on the same level as perhaps the registrars in your practice, because we have that as well. And they're going to be under a training program. So you need to make sure that these compliance requirements are followed and that you do not ask your doctor to pay you back. Now, another important thing I want to talk about quickly is when discussing this migration strategy or putting it together with your doctor, there are things that should happen from the beginning. So if your doctor is getting close to 45 years old, you need to consider that they might not be eligible for the permanent visas, the 186 direct entry stream very soon. So you have that conversation around, we would like you to stay here for 2 years, and then probably you would now be eligible for another stream. This helps with retention, and the point of getting a doctor is you want them to stay. You don't want to keep doing this. It's not good for business and it's not good for the practice. So I tell practices, have the conversation upfront. Other things to discuss is maybe one of the doctor's children might be turning 23 very soon, and they would not be eligible. If once a child turns 23, they cannot remain under their parent's visa. So it's something you also need to be aware of and have that conversation with the doctor you're employing. And another important thing is to be granted any visa, there are things we call the health requirements and also the character requirements. So you need to check the doctors if they have any convictions, and APRA would have taken care of that anyway. But more especially health requirements, because this would apply to both the doctor and their family. When I talk about health requirements, I don't mean whether the doctor has high blood pressure or anything. I'm talking of if there is any ongoing serious chronic health issue for the doctors, any member of his family. So do they have an autistic child, that would require ongoing care? Do they have a child with a disability that would require ongoing care? So that would affect the visa that you choose. Some visa subclasses you can get an exemption. Some visa subclasses you can't. So if these conversations are had upfront, you have a plan and you can avoid the, ticking time bombs, so to speak. And so most importantly, I'll just round up quickly. Think about costs before you start. What is this going to cost you? to become an approved sponsor, how much are you going to pay Home Affairs and your solicitors. And I've spoken about the health, location, family circumstances as well. And we offer a complimentary consultation if you need assistance to put together a strategy. If you have your doctor who has questions, please reach out. We are able to talk, and then you can make your decisions whether this is a pathway you need to go down. So thanks. It's a pleasure.
Welcome. Great to be here. It's great to kind of have your expertise in this, because it's like really such an all-in-one bringing our three skill sets together, I think. So I'm going to hand over to Megan to talk about the pathways, because this is how you describe it when people come to you, Megan.
Thank you. So I'm coming today from the perspective of someone coming in who hasn't worked in Australia before. We obviously have IMGs who are already working in Australia, and RECGP's new supervision model is a whole different thing that we can talk about another day. Today, I really wanted to focus on IMGs that are coming into Australia from overseas. So there are now 4 pathways. There previously were only 3, but ABRA came in and really irritated RECGP by bringing their own pathway. The standard pathway is the doctors that you have apply to you that talk about needing level 1 supervision. So to be eligible for that pathway, the doctors have to sit for their AMC exams. If they've sat just their AMC Part 1, they're eligible for limited. AMC Part 2, they're eligible for provisional. This is probably going a little bit too much in depth. All you need to know is that if you're looking at a CV and you see AMC, it means they're coming through on the standard pathway, and it means that they are most likely going to have level 1 supervision. And I will explain the supervision models in a little bit. The competent authority pathway is when they have worked in, and I will let you know why I'm emphasising that in a second. They have worked in the UK, USA, Ireland, the competent authority countries, basically. And the reason I emphasise the experience is that one of the most prevalent questions that I get from my doctors online is, well, I've done my PLAB from the UK, I can just come on the competent authority pathway. No, they have to have actually worked and done an internship equivalent in that country before they're eligible for that pathway. So this pathway is kind of a little bit better than standard pathway, because it means that they don't have to sit their AMC exams, which means as soon as they start with you, they'll have their provisional ARPA registration, and they've worked in a country that, kind of has a somewhat similar health system to Australia. So yeah, they'll be like PLAB, LNCC, it's all online, and I'm happy to send you out all of the exams that you can look for. So the specialist pathway is something that has really branched out over the last 2 years. So RECGP opened up the doors. It used to be a very limited list of qualifications from overseas that were eligible, but now it's quite large. So what it means is that a doctor has completed a fellowship as a general practitioner overseas in their country, or in a country that they're choosing to work and be registered in. So they've actually done a fellowship. They've done a full training pathway to be a GP, and now they want to come and work in Australia. So RECGP does a full assessment of their curriculum to identify whether or not it is comparable, and then it splits them into whether or not they're partially or substantially comparable. So a substantially comparable doctor can actually come into an M1 location and work metro, providing they're meeting their DPA. And a partially comparable doctor still needs to work in a regional location. So my quick tip there is always ask for their Part A before you think about offering them. Part A is basically the piece of paper that tells them that they have got their partial or substantial comparability. Expedited pathway is a new pathway that APRA has brought in, and you skip the college assessment and you go directly through to APRA. APRA has been very clear what qualifications are eligible, and they come in and they have specialist APRA registration. So they undergo a period of 6 months where they've got to do certain assessments and courses to make sure that they're meeting APRA's requirements. And after that 6 months, they've got unrestricted registration, which is pretty cool. Sarah, if I could just flip over to the next slide. The last slide was kind of in order of preference that I know my practices like to see them. From standard pathway, they're like, oh, level 1 is pretty full on, down to expedited pathway, which they don't really need a lot of support. They kind of just need to understand the ins and the outs of working in Australia. So just to go a little bit more in depth, because one of the things I see, and this is also for the doctors working in Australia, is practices trying to make sure that they can provide the level of supervision that the doctor is going to need. And it's so important because, especially for the standard pathway, these doctors are sitting at $2,500 pesky, and then they're spending $3,000 to get through APRA. So if they get to the other end of that, and then we send them over to Chioma to do their migration aspect, if they then can't get a Medicare provider number, or if they get there and their supervisor goes, actually, I've changed my mind, or whoops, I didn't realize I had to be there 100% of the time this doctor's working, they've essentially shelled out $5,000. And that doesn't sound like a lot when you think about the Australian $5,000 and doctors earning, $10,000, $15,000 a week. But for someone coming in from some of these overseas countries, the exchange rate sucks. And so they're saving up for half a year to be able to afford their pesky. So it's important for practices to keep in mind the detrimental impact that an offer without having the right supervision in place can make for these doctors. So for a level 1 supervised doctor, you do need to have a supervisor on site 100% of the time that this doctor is working. They do not have to be sitting in the room with the doctor, but they do have to be on site. And before the patient leaves the practice, that supervisor has to have checked. So what I usually recommend to my clients in this instance is start with an observership, get the doctor under supervision to be working right alongside their supervisor to begin with, so that they can build a relationship and understand how each other works. Once the trust level is built, that doctor can go and see their own patients, and you're going to know, and the supervisor is going to know what level of support that doctor's going to need. I mean, maybe it's just a quick bubble in between, a chat bubble that says, hey, this is the patient, this is what they came to me and this is what I recommended. The supervisor might message back and go, yep, that's great. It might be that the doctor that you have coming in needs to have the supervisor come into the room and physically see that patient as well. So the supervisor with experience is going to understand the level of support that supervisee needs. And from a booking perspective, making sure that you're starting off with the little things, starting off with, basic scripts and, the basic consults, and then working them up to the more complex cases is going to be the best way to support a doctor under level 1 supervision. I think that's everything for standard. Thanks, Sarah. Sarah's our slide master today. So competent authority, as I mentioned earlier, I just remembered something I wanted to say about the standard pathway. They can get level 2 supervision if they sit a level 2 pesky. We always tell practices, just pretend like they're going to get level 1. And if they decide they want to go for level 2, great. That's like a bonus. But APRA, even if they pass a level 3 pesky, could still give them level 1. So I always just say to practices, level 1 supervision. Okay, all right. We're done with standard. Sorry, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah, so much. Competent authority is when the doctor has completed the equivalent AMC exam, like a PLAB exam, or if you see PLAB on a CV, or you might see an LNCC, you can get excited and then jump down and make sure that they have actually worked and done a foundation year 1 if it's in the UK, but it's essentially an internship equivalent. So, a basic JMO role. And if they've done those 2 things, they're going to be eligible for competent authority, and we can usually shoot for that level 2 supervision. So again, level 2 is a little bit less intensive than level 1. You don't have to check every single patient before they leave the practice. And the supervisor only needs to be on site 80% of the time, which is kind of equivalent to these doctors that are going on our FSP. For those of you guys that are looking at FSP and RECGP accreditation, this is kind of what the first year of FSP would be as well. So you need to have your supervisor on site 80% of the time. You want them to be having daily catch-ups to discuss the patient load. I usually suggest to practices do it over lunch, have a sandwich and discuss patients, and obviously just having that supervisor on site for if the doctor's going to have any problems. And again, just planning your patient consult. So it's starting off with the little things and then building back up to the more complicated cases. It's just keeping in mind that even though these particular doctors have worked in an equivalent country, general practice in every country is just a little bit different. So, you know, the way you see patients might be different in your practice. And I mean, that's true of even a doctor coming from one practice in Australia to another practice. Sometimes you've got to kind of rejig their mindset to be like, okay, that's not how we see our patients here. Or ideally choosing a doctor, if you can, and you have that choice, that is going to match the existing skill set. Sorry, I feel like I'm waffling. We can move on to the next slide. Thanks, Sarah. So the specialist pathway and level 3. So in nearly all instances, do I need to look at that now, Sarah? Or should I come back to that one?
Level 3?
No? Okay, cool.
No.
We'll come back to it.
Keep going, keep going.
Okay, so in nearly all instances, these doctors will get level 3 supervision. If they don't meet their recency of practice, they might get level 2, but then they'll move up to level 3 very quickly once they've got that experience in Australia, usually for 4 weeks, and then they can move up to level 3. So the level 3 supervision requires there just to be someone somewhere in Australia that is available to them for phone support. This is something we're dealing with a lot at the moment because we're dealing with a lot of specialist pathway coming through and partially comparable. So they're going out to our regional practices, and we've had so many fantastic VR doctors step up and say, yeah, I'm happy to be an offsite supervisor. There still needs to be support on the ground for this doctor coming in because they're coming in from countries like Pakistan, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, countries where they still need to feel like they can come to someone and say, I'm not really sure how to do this referral, or this patient has come to me with this and it's just a little bit, obviously they've got that phone support or they can do Zoom support with their supervisor. But I don't know about you guys, I'm a panicker. I tend to panic. So, you know, in the instance, this doctor goes like, oh, I don't know what to do, and their supervisor's not available. Having another doctor on site with them or a very experienced practice manager or a registered nurse would be amazing. They can just like, I've got you. Let's do this together. That's always really helpful. And that's something that's just come up in the last 6 months. I'm getting a lot of calls from doctors that have started in practices that have a great offsite supervisor, but because there's no one to support them on site, they're panicking and they're wanting to leave to go to a practice that has someone on site to support them. So it's a really important recruitment note. And the same as the other two, just make sure you are giving them patient consults and building them up to the more complicated stuff. We can move on to the next one. Thank you, Sarah. I feel like we need like a little bell. It feels really rude to be like, no, Sarah, we're next. Pathway, and I'm watching the clock tick over. Expedited pathway, I'm actually really excited. I was really happy when they brought this pathway in because for doctors coming in from the New Zealand, from UK, and from Canada, they should just be able to come on over and start working under specialist APRA. Mostly their training is directly equivalent to ours, and APRA has recognised that and they've brought in these pathways. So these doctors really hit the ground running. They still need support to understand what item number am I going to bill on the MBS and, you know, where do I refer to? But I mean, that stuff is pretty straightforward and fortunately something that a practice manager or a receptionist can support them in. Indirect 2 is very similar to level 3 supervision, but the doctor needs to be able to come and visit them on site. So it feels a little bit backward to me. I think that the doctors coming in on the partially comparable should probably have indirect 2, and these doctors would probably be perfectly fine with level 3. But for indirect 2, make sure that the supervisor that you're assigning is somewhere in the near vicinity. You know, it might be the next practice over, it might be the next town over, but make sure they're not in a different state. Otherwise, you may have some problems. I've noticed that APRA is coming back and asking to have 4 weeks on-site supervision as well. So whoever supervisor you do have involved in here, make sure that they might be prepared to come and do 4 weeks of on-site with them if they're not local to the practice. Because I'm seeing APRA really popping their little faces up and saying that that's what they want, which again is crazy to me. I feel like it's stupidly sloppy around, but that is what it is. So I think we have one more slide, and that's just kind of a summary, I think, from memory.
That's it. Supervision.
No?
Supervision?
Supervision. Oh, yeah. It's just a summary slide, really. just so that you can kind of look at this and be like, you know, what do I have? The problems I see as a recruiter when doctors are coming to me, when they've come in, whether or not they start in the practice and they don't last through their rebate period, or there's a lot of interpersonal problems. What I'm seeing primarily is that that's coming from a poor onboarding and poor on-site support, and having these expectations of the doctors coming in that don't get realized, which it's up to me as a recruiter to make sure that I'm preparing my clients, and as practices, making sure that you are chatting to your recruiter or doing a bit of research beforehand to go, okay, where should my expectations be of this doctor? And given that all of these doctors require supervision, talking to the supervisor and saying to them, okay, what expectations should we have? Let's have a really clear plan in place for how to support our doctors and make sure that they're feeling the love coming in, they're being supported by the practice, and that if they do tend to be one of those doctors that really need to have their hands held, and we've all had one of those doctors, that we have the plan in place and the facilities to do so. So that's me. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. And if people want to get in touch with you, Megan, will you pop your details in the chat, or
I will.
Booking link,
yes.
or
Sorry,
however it is you want to do that? Well, I just want to make sure that people are thinking, oh my goodness, I need to talk to Megan because she knows all this stuff. I need to talk to her about my specific circumstances. Then they can book in with you. All right.
Good problem.
I'll speed through and make sure we've got a little bit of time for questions at the end, because we did hear that bell, which I guess might have been a question. But let me just explain why IMG engagements are different. It's because basically what you've heard from Chioma and Megan, unlike fully registered Australian trained doctors, IMGs often have specific conditions that they need to practice under, and these conditions affect how they practice and how your practice needs to support them. The key areas of challenge that we see is that most IMG risks arise in these areas, and understanding these areas is critical to protecting your practice. So the regulatory and registration challenges, contractual and structuring challenges, how are you going to bring them in terms of employment or independent practitioner, and how does that work with the visa requirements, and then governance and operational challenges, which Megan alluded to in her section of making sure people's expectations are aligned, I think. So IMG conditions determine how the doctor can practice. A lot of people who come to us just assume that that they can engage the practitioner however it is that they want, but practices really do need to make sure that their arrangements comply with all of the requirements. And what this slide actually doesn't cover, of course, is the fair work requirements, the legal requirements, which sometimes practices will come to us for specific advice on, so that they know that they are going in the right direction with which way they're engaging the GP or specialist in, depending on what sort of doctor they are when they join the practice. So supervision is a formal regulatory requirement, and Megan went through that in the different pathways. And so the engagement really needs to be structured to support that supervision appropriately and legally as well. Regulatory responsibility really extends beyond the IMG. Practices and supervisors also carry obligations. And so when practices are engaging with IMGs, we actually like to have a specific supervision agreement, because sometimes the supervisor isn't the practice owner. They might be an independent practitioner that's engaged by the practice, which means that having the clarity of how the supervision arrangement is going to work moving forward and in the day-to-day is critical to make sure that this process is successful for your business. So common mistakes we see made, assuming that having an IMG engaged is the same as any other doctor you've engaged with in the past. Using standard agreements that aren't designed specifically for IMGs, we see that as a mistake regularly. Failing to understand or define the supervision responsibilities, not aligning the contracts with the regulatory obligations, and then a lack of governance processes to make sure that the IMG is moving through the different stages that they need to with your practice in accordance with the college or the whatever pathway that they are following. And most of these are really preventable with proper structuring and proper planning because we don't want you to be encountering these risks. The regulators expect supervision to be properly supported, and practices really play a critical role in this. It's not just paying the recruitment fee or paying the visa recruitment obligations and then you're done. It's going to continue on you to keep being across this. And there's risk then across the life cycle of hiring an IMG. It's not just those initial upfront kind of costs and time that you need to think about it. Structuring risks can create significant financial exposure, and that might be employment law exposure if you engage them under the incorrect model, payroll tax liability that maybe you didn't budget for, superannuation obligations that might exist if the engagement isn't legally compliant, and then potential regulatory risk as well. I feel like I've got a lot of slides, but I'm just going to whip through them all, and then we'll send out a PDF of all of these slides as well. So don't panic if you didn't screenshot all of Chioma and Megan's very valuable slides as well. So the supervision and the legal structure, it really affects the legal classification, and the contracts need to reflect that. These are the key issues as lawyers that we look at when you come to us: the degree of control that the practice has over the practitioner, how independent they actually are, and when they're being supervised, there's a question about that independence. The legal classification in terms of how you are engaging with that person, and it will be different for every person probably that comes through your practice and the pathway that they're on, and then the compliance obligations that are required by whoever is making you supervise the person who's come in as well, if that's a college or if it's APRA. Visa considerations, there's additional obligations on that as well, which Chioma and Megan can talk to you about in more detail, probably through the initial stages of engaging with an IMG. Governance and documentation will help protect your practice. I know I bang on about it a lot, but these are key things to be thinking about. These signs indicate that there's risk. Using a standard agreement, one you found on the internet, one you asked ChatGPT to create, please don't do that. No separate supervision documentation, unclear supervision structure, and the lack of governance around the process. This scenario is pretty common. Someone using practices like yours using their standard agreement, supervision not being separately or properly documented, and then that creation of risk that you do not want, because most risk is preventable. So this is really the steps, I think. Understanding your regulatory obligations is critical, structuring arrangements appropriately, using agreements that are designed specifically for IMGs and specifically for the particular type of visa that they're on, and implementing processes to work through as your IMG works through the different levels, becoming accredited to practice here in Australia. Key takeaways from me, other than the one from the very beginning, which Megan mentioned, which is urgent, is really an elastic concept. It means different things to different people, but intentional structuring is my main takeaway for this. Really protects your practice. So There is additional complexity. We know that supervision will affect the way that you contract. Governance and documentation is critical. Just doing it on a handshake isn't possible. And proper structuring really protects your practice. So what can you do? These are the steps. I'm not going to read them all out to you, but if you're currently engaging or planning to engage an IMP, the most important step is to ensure that the arrangement is structured properly, hopefully from the outset. Many practices assume their existing agreements and processes are sufficient, but IMG engagements often require additional documentation. Recommended next step for us, we work with IMG practices that are engaging with IMGs. These are the sorts of things that we help them with: practitioner services agreements or employment agreements, supervision agreements, remote work policies potentially. We've got a senior lawyer in our team, Daniela, who just absolutely loves talking about IMGs and practice arrangements and your practice. So her booking link is here. Please feel free to register a call with her. That's complimentary. She'll just be happy to talk to you. It's her favorite thing. So feel free to use that booking link. We do this work all the time. If you've got a question for me, there's my booking link, and Chioma's was here as well, which we've put in the chat. Here's Megan's details. There you go. Megan, they are there. And we also have a Facebook group called You Legal for Doctors, which people are very welcome to join. I'm going to stop the slides so you can just see our faces, and then we can see if there's any questions. None so far. Oh, what about IMG as contractor, not employee? There's a question about that. So Philippa, I met another Dr. Philippa Lee this week. I wonder if it's you or if it's another person. That's something to get specific legal advice on, Philippa, because it's different in every circumstance. So it's not something to be able to answer easily on a webinar, unfortunately. Booking link for Chioma is there. Maybe the booking links are in the PowerPoint, which we'll send out. Any other questions? And we've passed our time, goodness. Megan's put a little note in there. Well, feel free to drop your number one takeaway in the chat or in the Q&A as you head out. Otherwise, it's been great working with you, Chioma and Megan. What were your takeaways?
I think for personally, my takeaway is engaging an IMG. It's nothing to be afraid of as long as it's done correctly. And there's a lot of help out there. So it's not something you should sort of throw through and try to wing it or try to guess or try to talk to your fellow practice manager or your fellow doctor. Each person's, I tell my clients all the time, each person's story is very different and very unique, and what would work for one practice wouldn't work for another practice, and what would work for one visa will be chaos for another person's visa pathway. So, and even listening to you talk is all about compliance and governance. And for Megan as well, there's a lot of compliance, procedure, processes. So if I was a practice manager or a doctor, there's no way I would be doing this myself because it's not worth it. Absolutely not worth the hassle.
There's a question that might be here for you, Chioma, actually. Can you explain why the GP cannot be asked to repay the expense of the visa? What's the purpose behind that requirement?
So it's an immigration requirement, and it was put in place to prevent people taking advantage of the vulnerability of the employees. So this is across board. It doesn't matter whether it's a GP or any of that. So we had severe cases of exploitation in the news a couple of years back, where some employers were telling people, for us to sponsor you, you would have to pay us 50 grand or 60 grand and some ridiculous amount. So it's now in the legislation and regulations that you cannot recoup those costs from your practice. It's a tax deductible expense. So you can request a tax deduction. Another way to look at it, though, is it also puts your nomination application at risk, because if you're indicating, oh, I want to engage this GP and I'm going to be paying him an income, the decision maker would question, well, if you're asking him to pay you back, can you really afford him? That's the context. Apart from the regulatory requirements, that's the context a decision maker assesses the application. So one of the questions you're always asked in an application is, are you, going to be requesting money back from the doctor? And another quick question I get, this is actually quite recent, was when the doctor was sponsored for a temporary visa. He worked for the practice for a couple of months, and now we got to the stage of applying for a permanent visa, but he was also invited to purchase the practice before doing that. So the question was, oh, can I be an owner and technically sponsor myself? And you would need to don't just assume that, oh, my friend, because the question I got was, my friend did it, it was all good, but it raises a lot of issues. There's you need to get tax advice apart from the migration advice, where you're now sponsoring, you're a self-sponsor, even if, especially if you're purchasing more than 20% of the unit trust shares. You need to get good advice, and don't assume that what happens with another practice would work for you. I say that again and again. So so that's the answer to your question. Is regulation, it was put in place to protect employees.
Yep, great. All right, we are running out of time. So Melissa, I think the answer to that, even if they pull out after you've paid, you can't recoup your money, and it's a legislative requirement. And honestly, we've seen cases in our practice of IMGs who've been treated absolutely appallingly by the practices that have engaged them. And so they're vulnerable coming to a new country. And as Chioma mentioned, people trying to make money out of having them come to Australia. So it's really a protection for those people who the government sees as more vulnerable than the practices. All right. There's one more here. It says, when IMG moves over within a year of having them on board on 482, is it possible to recover the levy for the rest of the years? That is from, is that the same, Chioma?
Is that what you mean if they've bought them over 4 years, but then they move over to PR after 1 year, and then there's like...
It doesn't say that, but it just says move. So Prash, you might need to book with one of us, probably Chioma, possibly Megan, on that, to get.
I think is a Chioma question.
Yes, I think it might be too. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Megan, do you want to talk about your takeaway from today?
Oh, the big takeaway, I think it was you that said it, Sarah, don't use ChatGPT. I use ChatGPT for everything, but I hear you when you say don't use it for contracts and things like that, because if you actually read through what ChatGPT does for you, because I did this a couple of weeks ago, just read what it writes. You definitely want to double check that stuff.
And if you don't have the expertise, you can't double check it properly. So yesterday I actually got a business sale agreement sent to me with the person who was the purchaser saying, the seller's created this, can you have a look at it? And I was like, no, they need to actually have a lawyer create it. It's going to cost me more to fix it than it does for them to actually do it properly in the first place. So that applies all sorts of places for legal services, I think. That's my high horse. So yep, agree with you on that, of course, as well, Megan. And I mean, I guess my big takeaway is it's amazing when you tap into these experts, how complex areas that you think you can navigate on your own might be. And I mean, just wonderful to have you both here today and to see the depth of your expertise really come out in the webinar, which is now 10 minutes over time, but that's okay.
Sarah, we appreciate you including us.
We're having fun, I guess. Yeah,
We are
thank you.
having fun. It was actually Chioma's idea, so thanks, Chioma.
It's a pleasure. Always a pleasure to work with both of you.
All right, I'm going to end the webinar. You people who are still attending know how to contact us if you need us, and we'll be back in the future, it sounds like.
Thanks, guys, so
All right.
much.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye.